Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Checking in from my father's house here in Florida. I don't have a candle, but I offer my smile. And let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? It's obviously a very different setup than I have in LA. But who's in the house on a Sunday night, Yom Rishon? Melissa in Great Neck, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Belle in Texas, Shandora in the Bronx, Moshe in Brooklyn, Frank in San Pedro, Chaim in Florida, Norman in Ohio, Nancy, North Carolina, Elise in Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Great to be with you. Our daf tonight is page 87. We're picking this up at the very bottom of page 86. Let me know if there's any issues with sound. I've seen that the mics are picking it up, so I'm hoping everything is okay. Okay, we're at the bottom of 86b, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 4 here in chapter 9 of Tractate Zevachim, the 29th volume of the Talmud, and we'll be covering page 87 today with God's help. So Mishnah number 4, right, is we're talking about, what we've been talking generally in this chapter about offerings that were disqualified. And therefore, let's say the meat that is to be burned on the altar should not have ascended the altar. Okay, but it was brought up in error. And if it was the flesh of an offering that was initially fit for the altar, then we understand that the altar sanctifies the flesh of that offering and it does not come back down. But the general principle is if it's a type of offering or the part of an offering that never should have ascended, never would have had a reason to be on the altar, then that altar does not sanctify that and it should come back down. And then here in Mishnah number 4, we're talking about the fire on the altar itself, the altar pyre, and basically, things that a burnt offering or other kinds of offering that it was time, the sacrificial portion of a sin offering that is consumed by the altar. Okay, so it's supposed to be burning on the altar and it's going to be reduced to ash. Well, what if in the process of burning on the altar, part of it came out of the fire? Are we going to put it back in the fire, right? These are the kinds of questions we've been examining. Okay, bottom of 86b. The Gemara previously explained the Mishnah as saying that limbs that were hardened by the fire, but not entirely consumed, are not returned to the altar if they were dislodged from it after midnight, since the mitzvah of burning has been performed, and the limbs are considered to have been entirely consumed, even if they were not literally reduced to ash. They were burning, they were on the altar pyre, they are hardened and dried out. It's close enough. And the period of burning is up through midnight, the first part of the night, because as we learned yesterday, the next part of the night can be that period that's basically a sign for the priest to come and clean out the pyre, the bonfire area on top of the altar to prepare for the next day's pyre. Now, it was stated that the Amoraim, right, the Amoraim as distinguished from the Tanaim are the earlier sages of the period of the Mishna, up through about the year 200 of the Common Era. The Amoraim are the sages of the Gemara, right, that first important layer of commentary on the Mishnah, from the year 200 to about the year 500, and it's the Gemara plus the Mishnah that equals the Talmud. Of course, we've had great sages, great minds, adding commentary to it ever since, but it's those two basic layers, the Mishnah plus the Gemara, that equals the Talmud. Okay, it was stated that Amoraim engage in a dispute concerning the following matter. In the case of, I'm just checking that there's no problem with the sound. You can hear me clearly. No one has said anything. Okay, great. Okay, it was stated that the Amoraim engage in a dispute concerning the following matter. In the case of limbs that separated from upon the altar before midnight and were returned after midnight, whereby the mitzvah of burning was not completed before midnight. They weren't burned up. They didn't reach a stage that you would call burned up. And so they were returned after midnight, which would seem to be later than the period when they should have been burned up. So what do we do about this? It's like they ascended, they descended. Are we going to put them back up? After midnight, where the mitzvah of burning was not completed by midnight. So Rabba says the second midnight, i.e. midnight of the following night, renders them consumed. And if they were dislodged from the altar thereafter, they are not returned. Rav Hisda says dawn following the first evening renders them consumed, and if they were dislodged from the altar thereafter, they are not returned. Now we are on 87a. So they say in the school of Rav, what is the reasoning of Rav Hisda, who says that dawn renders these limbs consumed? It is the following kal v'chomer inference. And if midnight, which does not cause the disqualification of being left overnight with regard to limbs that were left off the altar until that time, right? So remember that, for example, a sin offering, when is the time to consume a sin offering? On the day that it is slaughtered, and that night, right? That night, because there are portions of the sin offering that are eaten by the priest and portions of the sin offering that are consumed by the altar. But both of those kinds of consumption have to be completed that night after the day on which it was slaughtered. When you get to the next morning, no more consumption is possible, neither by the priest nor by the altar. It's going to have to be taken to the place of burning that is not the altar, right? It's no longer a sacrifice. Now you're just respectfully disposing of that which should have been consumed in its allotted time. And once that deadline passes, it can't be consumed in that way. It has to be disposed of in a different fire, right? So that's that deadline that they're talking about here. What is the reasoning of Rav Hisda, who says that dawn renders these limbs consumed? It is the following kal v'chomer inference. And if midnight, which does not cause the disqualification of being left overnight with regard to limbs that were left off the altar until that time, still causes consumption, i.e. limbs burned on the altar until midnight are considered entirely consumed. And the reason that the sages said that is because there also has to be a period of cleaning the altar before the next day. So that's why they said the first half of the night is enough for them to be consumed, as opposed to the deadline for putting them on the fire or eating them, which is dawn. Then certainly with regard to dawn, which causes the disqualification of being left overnight with regard to limbs that were not left off the altar until that time, isn't it logical that it causes consumption? We're not going to allow it, we're not going to use a deadline that's beyond dawn of the next day. Why would you say midnight of the second night? Now these Amoraim also dispute the law in a case where the limbs separated from the altar before midnight and were returned to the altar after dawn. And Rabba says that the second midnight renders them consumed, and if they separated after this time, they are not returned. Rav Hisda says, since these limbs were not returned to the altar by dawn, they are never subject to consumption through the passage of time. Rather, they are returned to the altar and allowed to burn until they are reduced to ash. These two disputes between Rabba and Rav Hisda indicate that both agree that limbs not on the altar by midnight are not considered consumed, that they're going to have to return to the altar before we would consider them consumed. And that also means that if you grab that limb for yourself, that ash, right? So the limbs of an offering that have been reduced to ash, they have completed their job, so to speak, of acting as a sacrificial offering on behalf of a person who brought that sacrifice. Since they completed their job, once they're reduced to ash, if somebody else grabs that ash and wants to make personal use of it, as fertilizer or something, they have not committed misappropriation of consecrated items, me'ilah, because it's no longer a consecrated item. It finished its job. But if it's not consumed, if it has not been consumed because it was not fully consumed and it was taken off the altar and before it was fully consumed, then according to this opinion, which says you could return it to the altar after midnight, then during that period, since it's not consumed and it's not considered consumed, neither it is not physically consumed nor is it considered consumed, then therefore if somebody made personal use of that object, he would be guilty of violating the prohibition of me'ilah, taking personal benefit from a consecrated item. Now, Rabbi Yosef objects to what was just said. And who shall say to us that midnight, specifically when the limbs are at the top of the altar, affects for them consumption? Perhaps anywhere that the limbs are found, midnight affects for them consumption. Maybe it doesn't matter how much they were burned or not burned. The fact is that once midnight has passed, that once the time has elapsed, we're going to consider them consumed no matter what state they're in. That's the question that Rabbi Yosef is asking. Perhaps anywhere that the limbs are found, midnight affects for them consumption. And the Gemara notes they sent from there, from Eretz Yisrael, that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, i.e. the passing of midnight renders all limbs consumed regardless of their location at that time. Now, are we talking about limbs that at least were on the fire for some time? Not limbs that never made it to the fire, surely. Now, it was also stated that Rabbi bar Abba says in the case of limbs that separated, sorry about that sound, it's my dad's dishwasher. Hopefully that's not too disturbing. In the case of limbs that separated from upon the altar before midnight and were returned to the altar after midnight, one may not benefit from them ab initio. But if one benefited from them after the fact, he is not liable for me'ilah, since the mitzvah of burning is considered fulfilled after midnight has passed. And Bar Kapara also taught if they separated them from upon the altar before midnight and they were returned to the altar after midnight, the limbs are removed from being subject to liability for me'ilah. No more me'ilah because midnight has passed, even if they were removed and put back. Rav Papa said to Abaye, and since they sent from there that the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, that midnight affects consumption even for those items left off the altar, and Rav Chia bar Abba says this as well, and Bar Kapara also teaches that this is the law, then with regard to what do Rabba and Rav Hisda disagree? And Abaye said to him, they disagree with regard to fatty limbs, whose consumption is delayed due to their surrounding fat, and consequently midnight may not affect consumption for these limbs, but it seems like the general consensus is that they do. So even though the limb itself might not be fully consumed by the fire, once midnight has passed, it has been on the fire, it has burned to some extent, it's considered consumed and me'ilah no longer applies. New topic. Rava raises a dilemma before Rabba. Is the disqualification of being left overnight effective in disqualifying limbs that are situated at the top of the altar at dawn, but were not placed on the pyre? Or is it not effective in disqualifying limbs that are at the top of the altar, but were not placed on the pyre? Right? These were limbs that were meant to be consumed by the altar. They were not disqualified. Right? These are valid offerings, validly brought. Everything was done correctly. They were brought up on the altar of qualified offerings. They were supposed to be placed on the altar. And there, something went wrong. The priest dropped it. It didn't put it on the fire. He got interrupted. Something went wrong. And so this limb that went up the altar, which generally sanctifies even if something was disqualified, this wasn't disqualified. It just never made it to the fire. So the fact that it should have been on the fire but wasn't placed on the fire, and now night has elapsed, dawn has risen the next day, and now we're beyond the time when it should have been consumed by the altar, beyond the deadline. So what's going to happen now? And the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances? If we say that the limbs have not descended from the altar, well, then the law should be obvious. Now that with regard to limbs that were left overnight in the temple courtyard, and you said in the Mishna on page 84 that if they ascended upon the altar, they shall not descend, right? Those were disqualified because they left the courtyard. Another kind of disqualification, like being beyond its time, this is being outside its place. And yet, since there was an initial period of fitness, if they go up on the altar sanctifies them and does not, even though they're disqualified, we can place them on the pyre because the altar sanctified them. Well, then these limbs that were never disqualified, they were up on the altar. Doesn't the altar continue to sanctify them so that they could go on the pyre the next day? That's what they're saying. Then with regard to limbs left on the top of the altar, is it necessary to teach that they shall not descend? You're just going to put them on the fire the next day. But rather, the dilemma is in a case where they were left overnight on top of the altar and they descended from it after dawn. So the next day, the priest said, oh, we should have burned it last night. We didn't. So we take it off the altar. And then somebody says, oh, no, you should have left it up there. But he already took it down. Is it going to go back up? But rather, the dilemma is in a case where they were left overnight on top of the altar and they descended from it after dawn. Do we compare limbs left overnight on top of the altar to the table of the showbread? And they are therefore returned, as we learned in a Mishna, right? The showbreads. Now that's inside the sanctuary. All of this is when the temple was standing, which it hasn't in 2,000 years. But when the temple was standing, the altar was in the courtyard in front of the sanctuary, the entrance to the sanctuary. Inside the sanctuary was the table of the showbreads, where there were 12 thick loaves of unleavened bread that were changed out every Shabbos. And one of the miracles of the temple, at least the first temple, is that those loaves remained fresh all week. Imagine that smell, that beautiful smell of bread baking in your oven, how the most wonderful smell that a house can have. And it smells like that all week long. And then they get changed out on Shabbos. The new batch go in, the old batch come out, and that's a gift to the priests who are serving in the temple at that time. They eat those breads. Now they're supposed to be changed every Shabbos. What if they're not changed on Shabbos? Then what? What can we learn from that, from the showbreads, who are, let's say, in their place beyond their time? If we learn a law about them, can we extend that law to limbs that were on top of the altar but not consumed in the altar pyre? The next day, are we going to put them on the pyre? And then they were taken down. Are we going to return them? Right. So let's see. What do we learn from the showbread? So we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Menachos 100, page 100a, even if loaves of showbread, which are supposed to be replaced every Shabbos, remained on the table many days beyond Shabbos, there is nothing wrong with that. And the loaves are not disqualified by being left overnight. So it's interesting. It's not that they were removed and put back. It's just that they were left in their place beyond their time, right? Beyond that Shabbos. I thought we're talking about not where it was just left on the altar without being burned in the pyre, but removed from the altar and then taken. And then we're asking, do we take it back? So it's a little bit different. But what they seem to be saying is, well, just like the breads can be there beyond their time and they're not disqualified, something that was on top of the altar beyond its time, since it was sanctified by the altar, even if you took it back, we're going to learn out that you can even though you took it down, we can take it back up. Is that what they're saying? Let's keep reading. So even if loaves of showbread, which are supposed to be replaced every Shabbos, remained on the table many days beyond Shabbos, there's nothing wrong with that, and the loaves are not disqualified by being left overnight. Or perhaps we compare the limbs to flesh left on the ground of the temple courtyard, which is disqualified when left there until dawn, and they are not returned, right? If it was just left in the courtyard, it didn't make it up the ramp to the altar, and dawn came up the next day, right, for a burnt offering or a sin offering, okay, that's beyond its time. Now we're certainly not going to take it up the altar. Now we're going to take it to dispose in a different fire. Rabba said to him, there is no disqualification of limbs that are left overnight at the top of the altar. And the Gemara asked, did Rabba accept this response from Rabba or not? And the Gemara suggests, come and hear proof from that which was stated. With regard to limbs that were left overnight in the temple courtyard, the priest may place them upon the altar to burn them all night long, provided that they were placed there before dawn. Before dawn. So they have to make it to the altar pyre before dawn, which is when the time of consumption expires. So they weren't left beyond their time in the courtyard if they made it up to the altar pyre before dawn. Now, with regard to a limb that was left at the top of the altar, the priest may burn it forever, i.e. no matter how much time has passed, right? Because the altar continues to sanctify it. So as long as it's on top of the altar, no matter how many days have passed, according to this opinion, you can still put it on the altar pyre. Now, with regard to limbs that were left overnight on top of the altar and then descended from it, Rabba says that they shall go back up, they shall ascend, while Rabba says they shall not ascend, and conclude from it that Rava did not accept the response from Rabba, as he holds here that limbs are disqualified when left overnight on top of the altar, and the Gemara confirms, indeed, conclude from it that this is so. If it's on top of the altar, then no matter how many days have passed, you can put it on the fire. But even if it was on top of the altar, if it came back down off the altar and now we're past the time when it should have been burned, we don't walk it back up the altar. Then the question would be, well, it ascended, it was up there too long, they took it down, and then somebody walked it back up anyway. He shouldn't have, but he did. Now what? Sounds like we probably would leave it up there. No, because it shouldn't have gone back up, but now it did. And does the altar sanctify it that time? That's my question. It's not being asked here. Now, new topic. The Mishna teaches, just as the altar sanctifies items, so too the ramp and the service vessels sanctify items. Now, with regard to this law, the sages taught, the verse states, whatever touches the altar shall be sacred. Exodus 29:37. Now from here I have derived only that the altar sanctifies items. From where is it derived that the ramp sanctifies them as well? And the verse states, and you shall anoint the altar, es hamizbeach, in Exodus 40 verse 10. And the addition of the word es, or some would pronounce it et, right? This is a word that comes up in Hebrew that doesn't have an equivalent in English. It doesn't have a meaning in itself. But when you have a verb and a direct object, you add this sort of linking word that doesn't have a meaning in itself. But since it doesn't have a meaning in itself, the sages feel there's nothing extraneous, and if it could have been said without it, it must be that it means something. So here they're attaching a meaning to it. The addition of the word et serves to include the ramp. With regard to service vessels, from where is it derived that they sanctify items? And the verse states with regard to them, whatever touches them shall be sacred. Now the concept here is, let's say that there was blood of an offering that was initially fit for to have its blood sprinkled on the altar, and then somehow after the blood was collected, the blood became tameh, or the offering became disqualified, and yet you placed it in a service vessel. I guess the animal became disqualified, but you slaughtered and collected its blood. So are we going to sprinkle the blood? Sounds like you should not sprinkle the blood, but perhaps if you did it anyway after the fact, it achieves atonement for the person in the case of a sin offering, because just as the altar sanctifies something and you leave it on the pyre, or let's put it this way, it won't achieve atonement for the owner, but you allow it to continue its journey. So just as the offering was disqualified, but the meat was taken up on the altar anyway, we're going to put it on the fire. So if the offering was disqualified, but its blood was collected in the service vessel anyway, we will now sprinkle it on the side of the altar. It won't achieve atonement for the owner, but the service vessel sanctifies it so that it can be sprinkled on the altar. Reish Lakish raises a dilemma before Rabbi Yochanan. What is the law with regard to whether service vessels sanctify disqualified items? what I just said, right? It's more like a question than a statement. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, you learned in the Mishnah that just as the altar and the ramp sanctify items that are suited to them, even if those items are disqualified, so too the service vessels sanctify items that are placed in them. And so what goes in a service vessel? The blood that's collected from an animal offering, or the wheat flour, right? The meat from a meal offering, the flour from a meal offering goes into a service vessel, and then it's carried up the altar in order to be placed on the fire. So that's how service vessels are used. Again, so Reish Lakish raises a dilemma before Rabbi Yochanan. What is the law with regard to whether service vessels sanctify disqualified items? And Rabbi Yochanan said to him, you learned in the Mishnah that just as the altar and the ramp sanctify items that are suited to them, even if those items are disqualified, so too the service vessels sanctify items placed in them. That's our Mishnah that we're learning right now. So Reish Lakish said to him, the Mishnah indicates that service vessels sanctify that which is placed in them in the sense that they may no longer be redeemed even if they become disqualified. Right? They may no longer be redeemed even if they become disqualified. That's a different kind of sanctification than we're going to place them on the altar. I raised the dilemma with regard to whether service vessels sanctify disqualified items so that they may be sacrificed. Ab initio. Ab initio meaning, even if we're going to say, well, after the fact it's going to count, but you shouldn't have done it, Reish Lakish is saying, well, if you're saying that service vessels sanctify that which goes into them, even from a disqualified offering, so shall we say ab initio, that you may then sprinkle it on the altar, in the case of blood, or place it on the altar pyre, in the case of a meal offering. So Rabbi Yochanan said to him, this also we learn in a Mishnah on page 84a. And now we're on page 87b. An offering that people unfit for performing the temple service collected and then sprinkled its blood shall not descend from the altar if it ascended. Okay, that's what we've been talking about in this chapter, that the altar sanctifies even disqualified offerings as long as it had a time of fitness. Once it goes up on the altar, we're going to let it continue and go on the altar pyre. So says Rabbi Yochanan, what is it not that the Mishnah means that people unfit for performing the temple service collected the blood, and people unfit for performing the temple service sprinkled it as well, which disqualifies it from ascending the altar, right? Because remember, an offering does not have to be slaughtered by a priest, but its blood does have to be collected by a priest, conveyed to the altar by a priest, and sprinkled by a priest. So if we're talking about the disqualification that occurs because somebody who's unfit for the temple service, either a non-priest or a priest with a blemish, for example, did something, well, it must be that the unfit person collected the blood, conveyed it, or sprinkled it. And so we're not talking about meat going up on top of the altar. We must be talking about blood going on the side of the altar. But if the collection alone was performed by people unfit for performing the temple service, although the offering becomes disqualified, those fit to perform the temple service may sprinkle the blood and sacrifice the offering ab initio. And so the reason apparently is that service vessels sanctify disqualified blood such that it may be sprinkled ab initio, right? So they're saying it was a split. It turned out that a priest collected the blood, realized that he was blemished, handed it off to another priest, and that second priest, who was not blemished, conveyed it to the altar and sprinkled it. So it must be that even though it was disqualified by that blemished priest collecting it, the service vessel itself must have sanctified so that a fit priest can complete the journey of the blood to the altar. Reish Lakish rejects this proof of his colleague and mentor, Rabbi Yochanan. Says Reish Lakish, no. And by the way, we're on 87b now. So no, the Mishnah may be referring to two independent cases, i.e. that people unfit for performing the temple service collected the blood, or that people unfit for performing the temple service sprinkled the blood after it was collected by people who were fit for performing the temple service. Accordingly, the Mishnah teaches only that if such offerings ascended the altar, they shall not descend after the fact. But service vessels do not sanctify disqualified items such that they are offered ab initio. We haven't proved that. Now, the Gemara raises a different dilemma. Is the airspace above the altar considered as the altar itself, whereby items that enter this airspace shall not descend from the altar, or is it not considered like the altar? Now, that's a fascinating question for them to be asking, 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. Isn't that an amazing question? We talk about in a city, the airspace rights. People didn't used to think that way. It's like you just own property, you own land, right? And and people built their 1, 2, 3, 5, 6-story walk-ups, right, in the 17 and 1800s. And then eventually they made elevators. They invented elevators, and then skyscrapers started to happen, right? And so then there became a question about the value and the ownership of the airspace above a property. Well, long, long ago, the sages were already asking about airspace, and we've had airspace issues many times already before in our journey through the Talmud, when we're talking about Shabbos and transferring an object on Shabbos from one domain to another, where it didn't actually land in the domain but crossed through the airspace of that domain. Have you violated Shabbos if you caused the object to move through the airspace of the public domain when you threw it, from a private domain through the airspace of a public domain and landed in your own private domain? Did you violate Shabbos? Questions like that. Here they're saying, okay, being on the altar sanctifies a disqualified offering, such that now we're going to allow the meat of that offering, the flesh of that offering, to continue its journey to the altar pyre. Well, presumably, what we mean by that is because it's not going to be rolling up on the ground itself, on the floor, the stone floor of the ramp, and then the altar top itself, but a priest who is barefoot. And remember, now this is important, that priests were always serving barefoot, so that they were in direct contact with the floor of the temple courtyard, with the floor of the sanctuary, with the floor of the ramp, and with the floor of the altar itself. So presumably when you say that the altar sanctifies the flesh of an offering, so that even though it's disqualified, you can place it on the altar pyre, it's because it was in the hand or in a service vessel being held by a priest whose feet were on the ramp or on the altar. Okay, what if his feet weren't on the altar? What if somehow you dangled the flesh of that offering right above the altar? Does the airspace of the altar sanctify the same way that a priest standing there and holding it would sanctify it? Is the airspace above the altar considered as the altar itself, whereby items that enter this airspace shall not descend from the altar, or is it not considered like the altar? And the Gemara suggests, come in here the Mishna, which states, just as the altar sanctifies items, so too the ramp sanctifies items. And if they ascended upon it, they shall be sacrificed upon the altar and shall not descend. And if you say that the airspace above the altar is not considered as the altar itself, then the airspace above the ramp as well should not be considered as the ramp. If so, how can we elevate the disqualified limbs of an offering from the ramp to the altar? The moment one elevates a limb from upon the ramp, it is considered to have descended from the ramp, and all disqualified items that descended shall not be returned. I confess I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding and imagining what they're saying. I read it earlier and I didn't quite get it then. I was hoping I would get it now, and I'm still having trouble. So they're saying, the question is, does the airspace above the altar sanctify items like the altar itself? And to answer that question, they're saying, well, just as the altar sanctifies, the ramp sanctifies. Now, why is the ramp comparable to the airspace above the altar? I'm not sure. So, but they say, and if you say that the airspace above the altar is not like the altar, then the airspace above the ramp as well should not be considered as the ramp. And if so, how can one elevate the disqualified limbs of an offering from the ramp to the altar. Again, if the priest is carrying it, what difference does it make? I guess what they're saying is when the priest is stepping from the ramp to the altar, as he's crossing in, right, he doesn't have his foot on the altar yet. And so at that moment, his foot is on the ramp and the limb is actually entering the airspace of the altar. And if you're saying that the airspace doesn't sanctify, then it's like you've, I guess, left the ramp, and we could consider it like descending even though you were moving up toward the altar, I guess is what they're saying. Now the Gemara responds, the Mishna is referring to a case where the priest drags the offering up the ramp. Okay, so he kept it in contact with the floor, but it never enters its airspace. Gemara challenges this. But even if he drags it up the ramp, he must still lift it, as there is a space between the ramp and the altar. And the Gemara responds, since this gap is small, only a minority of the limb of an offering will be located over the gap as it passes from the ramp to the altar. Therefore, when a majority of the limb is on the ramp, the minority situated above the gap is considered as if it is on the ramp. And once a majority of the limb is on the altar, the minority situated above the gap is considered as if it is on the altar. So again, on the altar, not in its airspace. The Gemara asks, if so, resolve from this Mishnah the dilemma that was raised by Rami Bar Chama. Is there a connection of limbs that ascend upon the altar? I.e., is an offering considered a unit, such that even those parts that do not ascend the altar shall be considered as if they are upon it? Or is there not, and each part is considered independent? Well, based on the previous answer, resolve the dilemma by saying that there is a connection of limbs. And the Gemara responds, this is not difficult, as one may indeed resolve Rami Bar Chama's dilemma from here. So they are connected. So Rabba bar Rav Hanan objects to the assumption that the airspace above the altar is considered as the altar itself. But if you say that the airspace above the altar is considered as the altar, then with regard to a bird burnt offering, that one disqualified by having the intention to burn it beyond its designated time, i.e. the day after it was pinched, how can you find the circumstances for such a disqualification to take effect? And the Gemara explains, one's intent to burn an offering beyond its designated time disqualifies it only when he intended to burn it during a time that he may not do so. And since a bird burnt offering is pinched in the airspace above the altar has already accepted it. Therefore, even if one delayed burning it until the next day, it does not descend from the altar like all other offerings that are disqualified by being left overnight. Got about 10 minutes to go.
How much more time?
Like 10 minutes. I am beyond my quiet time here on the East Coast. Okay. So Rav Shimi bar Ashi objects to the objection raised by Rabba bar Rav Hanan. Why is it not possible for a bird burnt offering to be disqualified through the intention to burn it beyond its designated time? You find it in a case where he says, I am hereby pinching it in order to take it down from the altar tomorrow, and thereafter sacrifice it and burn it. And if he takes it down from the altar the next day, he may not subsequently return it there for burning, as all disqualified items that have descended from the altar shall not be returned to it. Accordingly, even if the airspace above the altar is considered as the altar itself, a bird burnt offering can still be disqualified with such intention. Now the Gemara questions the objection of Rav Shimi bar Ashi. This works out well according to the opinion of Rabba, who says that the disqualification of being left overnight is effective even when the offering is at the top of the altar. So we learned earlier in today's class, right? If you're on top of the altar, can you be disqualified? Rava says that yes, it can be disqualified by being left overnight even when it is on top of the altar. Accordingly, if he were to take the bird burnt offering down from the altar the next day, he may not restore it to the altar for burning. But this is difficult according to the opinion of Rabba, who says the disqualification of being left overnight is not effective when the offering is at the top of the altar. And therefore, Even if the next day he removed the bird burnt offering from the altar, he must return it there to burn it, as it has not been disqualified. If so, his intention is not significant, i.e., he does not disqualify a bird burnt offering with such intention. And Rav Shimi bar Ashi responds, according to the opinion of Rabba as well, you find a case of a bird burnt offering that is disqualified due to one's intention, such as where he says, I am hereby pinching it in order to take it down from the altar before dawn and to then sacrifice it after dawn. In such a case where the offering is removed from the altar before dawn, even Rabba would agree that one's intention renders a bird burnt offering disqualified by being left overnight. Just going to hustle, all right? Rav Shimi bar Ashi adds, irrespective of the validity of the proof of Rabba bar Rav Hanan, in any event, resolve the issue to this side, i.e. in favor of the claim that the airspace above the altar is considered as the altar itself, as if it enters your mind that the airspace above the altar is not considered as the altar. Then, with regard to the case of disqualified bird sin offering that was pinched at the top of the altar, how does one sprinkle from its blood on the wall of the altar? When the priest raises the bird in his hand in order to sprinkle its blood, the bird is considered to have descended from upon the altar, and he cannot sprinkle its blood. Right? If the airspace above the altar isn't like the altar, are they saying and the priest's feet are not on the floor? Well, then, if the airspace is not like the altar and his feet are not on the floor, then it's like you took it off the altar and you can't put it back. That's the issue. When the priest raises the bird in his hand in order to sprinkle the blood, the bird is considered to have descended from upon the altar, and he cannot sprinkle its blood. As the law with regard to all disqualified items is that once they have descended from upon the altar, they won't go back up. Likewise, concerning the blood of other offerings that were disqualified, that is ascended upon the altar, how does he sprinkle from their blood, since it is sprinkled from the airspace above the altar? Rather, it must be that the airspace above the altar is considered as the altar. The Gemara rejects this proof, and I'm almost done, so questions or comments, get them in. It is possible that in such cases one does not sprinkle the blood in its normal fashion, but in such a manner that he presses it against the wall of the altar immediately without the blood passing through the air. And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Is this considered sprinkling? It is squeezing, an act that is performed for a bird burnt offering, not for a bird sin offering. And likewise, if one sprinkles the blood after of other disqualified offerings in this manner, is this sprinkling? No, it is pouring. And furthermore, with regard to a disqualified bird burnt offering in the manner, is the manner of sprinkling in such a fashion? And in the case of other disqualified offerings, is the manner of sprinkling in such a fashion? It is not. Rather, the airspace above the altar must be considered as the altar. And Rav Ashi said, if the question concerns a case where the priest held the blood or the limbs while standing at the top of the altar, they would indeed be considered as having ascended the altar and shall not descend from it. But when the dilemma was stated with regard to the airspace above the altar, it was with regard to an instance where he suspended them with a pole above the altar, while he himself stood on the floor of the temple courtyard. What is the law in that case? Says the Gemara, Teku, it shall stand unresolved. So that's what my confusion. Like in all these cases, if his priest has his feet on the floor of the altar, he's on the altar. If you put the flesh up there on a fishing pole while he's standing down at the courtyard level, and it's now above the altar, now does the airspace of the altar sanctify that offering? We don't know, because that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 4. Okay. Let me see if I can get a question or two before I must sign off, not to keep my dad up. Just one question from Ilanit. On Daf 84, it is mentioned that if an animal arrives atop the altar alive, it can be slaughtered right there in its spot. But then, how would the blood be splashed on the altar sides and corners? Right, that's such a good question. And you're not supposed to slaughter it up there, right? If it ascends alive, it should be taken back down. But if he slaughtered it anyway, after the fact, it's considered a valid slaughter, and it must be that blood is going to have to be taken down, right, off the top in order to be sprinkled. I think that is what they need to do, just as you're suggesting. Okay, that's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, the regular time, Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific.